I want to thank Skoto and Alex for allowing me the chance to show the work that I've labored over for the last 35 years. For people who know me, they know that I have had pretty much the same thought for my whole adult life. I call this thought the absolute gap. I've known Skoto and Alex for about 10 years, and after a couple of visits to my studio, Skoto and Alex offered me a show. I said, great, can we call it the absolute gap? They said that would be fine, but maybe we need to get somebody in here who knows what they're talking about. I've been talking about the gap in one form or another for at least 25 years. Nobody knows what I'm talking about. If I talk about the gap, people get nervous and start looking for exits in the room. I think the best time to talk about the gap is just when I sit down for lunch with somebody. I have a captive audience. I start rambling about my work and how it relates to the gap. My lunchmates usually start looking at their watch, and I can feel themselves saying, okay, 5 minutes, and I will have to cut him off. People call me a gap head. I've gotten smoother over the years in my conversations, and I have stopped stuttering over the gap. And yet nobody knows what I'm talking about more than anybody except for my wife of 20 years, Jean. More than anyone else, she's been a good sport, listening to me patiently. The main argument of the gap is that there is a blind spot within the unconscious that keeps us from being fully informed of who we are in the world. This blind spot is intricately tied to the nothingness of our existence. There is no real you within you. And so the question becomes, if there is no real me within me, how do I live? How do I become me? How do I make art if I do not know what the object is? Imagine going into a gallery and saying that you do not have the object. I had it and it slipped between my fingers. Imagine saying that the object cannot be represented, but is a space in between. I make art. That is what I do. The space in between is what has hounded and haunted me for my whole adult life. I am not a philosopher, and I've never taken a philosophy course in my life. Yet, I believe continental philosophy is immersed in my work. I had to create art that would reflect exactly how I felt and continue to feel today. Through it all, I've kept a sense of humor in my art and my life. I think I am funny. But I've been assured many times over that I'm not very funny. So here we are today with Simon Critchley. He's one of the most foremost continental philosophers in the United States. Simon likes humor, but I do not know if he is funny. No. He has written many books, of which two are my favorites. One is Very Little, Almost Nothing, and Faith of the Faithless. And he's come out with his new book, What We Think About When We Think About Soccer. He's a moderator at Stone, part of the New York Times opinion series featuring the writers of contemporary philosophers and other thinkers that is both timely and timeless. I also want to thank Gary Gutting, the philosopher, for introducing us, which in turn has helped make today possible. My hope in the long run is that the language of the gap becomes part of the American vernacular as a bulwark against authoritarian tendencies that we are seeing, that we're starting to see throughout the world today. Today, I hope, is the beginning of that conversation. So.
Oh, okay. Want me to? I thought we were going to go through the timeline.
Well, this is the timeline right here. Yep.
Yeah. Could we?
So I was born so just to talk about how I came to be an artist. I was born in Holland, and when I was 6 years old, we moved to Fairfax, Virginia, where I learned how to speak English. After about 2 years, even after about 6 months, I was pretty good at speaking English, and I was feeling pretty comfortable about where I was living. And in 1966, when I was 8, my father said to me, let's move to the Ivory Coast, where I could learn how to speak French. So after totally learning how to speak English for 2 years from my Dutch, 2 years later, I was actually going to a totally French school, had no idea what anybody was saying, and over the course of 2 years, had to learn how to speak French. After the 2 years, I was totally fluent in French, and I was really getting comfortable and enjoying living in West Africa when my parents says, let's go back to the United States. And so the year later, when I was 10 years old, we moved back to the United States, and I had to learn how to speak English again. So at that point, I was pretty fluent in all of these three languages, and I was pretty comfortable with myself. But I was also totally confused about being back in the United States and trying to learn how to speak English. So
what language do you dream in?
Well, I dream in English
Okay.
at this point. Yeah,
Right.
the Dutch is pretty well, the Dutch and French have pretty well gotten lost over the years. So what happened was that over the years, I had really struggled with the fact, well, if I speak these three languages, who am I really? My parents weren't really that religious, so we didn't go to church. We did move around a lot, even more than just kind of skipping a few of the other things, but we lived in Canada and other places. And so the question was, it was really kind of a struggle for me, like, who am I really? And so that kind of was upsetting to me, and I think, I was kind of starting to be kind of abusive to myself at a pretty early age. I just wasn't doing that well in school, and it was really kind of a struggle for me because I didn't get the English language, I didn't get the grammar, the math I kind of didn't understand because I learned it in French, but my French grammar was impeccable, so so it was a question like who am I, how did I become this person, that speaks three languages? It's like I had a postmodern self, but there was no real me inside of me. It's easy for me to go from one language to another and kind of impress people that I spoke three languages, but there had to be something inside of me that was like kind of a rock hard place, religion really wasn't part of that kind of thing as something that was internal to, at least to my family, so it really wasn't thought. So by the time I was in high school, I guess I was somewhat fairly abusive to myself, but it was really bothering me. And I did, get like a 2-year degree to manage a restaurant, and I was managing a restaurant, and I just was not, didn't feel like I was living up to my potential of who I was as a person. So, so I hit the road. I had a 68 Camaro.
Oh, well.
Jumped in the car and, I knew I could pretty much work anywhere in the United States. So I worked, I moved to Texas. I lived there for about 4 months. Worked in a restaurant. Was really I thought about just being on the road for 1 year. I was reading all the great American classics, such as D.H. Lawrence, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Jack Kerouac, being on the road and things like that. So there was this kind of like, I was teaching myself how to, how to find me, and that's what I was looking for, So I drove around Mexico for a couple of months, was around Mexico City and went to Puerto Vallarta, came up through Cabo San Lucas, and came up through Monterey, and I thought, Steinbeck, the grapes of mice and men. I thought I would like live in Monterey. Of course, I get there, and it's like really this pretty fancy place, and there was like, I really couldn't afford to live here. And on top of that, there was some kind of golf tournament going on, so every hotel was booked. Right. So, and this is in the early, this is in the late 70s. So anyway, I drove to Santa Cruz, and I lived there for another 4 months, working as a short order chef in a restaurant, and kind of enjoyed California, which is kind of, and nobody's ever lived there. It's just a totally different space. After 4 months, I decided to attend back to the university and started taking photography classes, because all the time I was taking pictures and.
In California.
In California and in Texas, and I was really enjoying taking pictures, really with an old Nikon F, and so I was really kind of getting my bearings as a photographer, and just simple, beautiful pictures of my travels, and getting a sense of being what it is on the road type of thing. So I went back to school at Old Dominion University. Still no real sense of self, but I'm still kind of gung ho on it. I'm sure I'm going to be able to find that person. And came to Old Dominion University, started taking black and white photography courses. It was really kind of interesting, and I really enjoyed it. I had come in with I had intended to become like an engineer, and when I got there, I started taking engineering courses to get an engineering degree. That's why I was accepted. And when I got there, I said, I'm going to take photography.
Right.
So the more I became on my journey, the more I became involved in being an artist. Came to spend about a year in Old Dominion University and decided to come to New York City and study at the School of Visual Arts. And then I came up with the idea that because I've been to so many different places, you kind of come to a place in this with a wide open perspective. You're open to all the different vistas and everything like that. And that period only lasts for maybe 3 or 4 months before you kind of like get into the grind of like being, that person having to deal with work and all these other things. So I thought that if I came in with this kind of wide open perspective of being a new New Yorker, all I had to do was kind of like focus my energy, and at the end of it, I would find my true self as a real New Yorker. So that was kind of the thinking behind it. Now, I'm 3 years on my journey to try to get to.
So was that the decision? The decision to come to New York was linked to this question?
No, it was really more of a decision to once I realized that I came here. I kind of fell in love with the fact that this was New York City and it was a melting pot. There was just so many different ideas, as opposed to being in Galveston, Texas. You're in a very small community, and it just wasn't very open, to me. And California just had its own kind of vibe in Santa Cruz. It had a kind of like, which was a great vibe, but it just didn't have the wide openness of New York City, because you have all these different vibes in New York City. Whereas the other places that I lived only had a particular vibe that was going on. So I fell in love with New York City right from the beginning, and came in, and that was the idea. I come in with a wide vista and slowly focus my energy, into getting tighter and tighter. And of course, the more I focus, the more anxious I'm getting, because there's still no real self. There has to be some kind of a bedrock of the soul type of thing. There has to be a real me inside of me,
Right.
And I kept on putting more and more pressure on myself, and you see it in the photographs. The photographs getting narrower and narrower.
Right. That's what leads to the portrait of the artist.
Yeah, this is portrait of the artist, and these are some of the photographs. So they're kind of toward the end here, and then all of a sudden, and I love kind of this, putting the shadow, the faces in the shadow, and it's getting darker and darker, and so here the faces then, and so all of a sudden, within one day, all of a sudden I took this picture, and I went into the dark room, and
It's back there, right?
that photograph over there, and I realized that this, didn't realize it, of course, when I'm taking the photograph, but it was one of those photographs that kind of changed your life, for you. You saw it and you didn't see it until you saw it in the dark room, how profound the photograph was. But everything is starting to fall apart on me. I'm literally just, I feel like there's things going on. I'm not sleeping. I've lost. I'm not eating. Honestly, I'm starting to hallucinate. I'm having, really a psychotic breakdown. So I had a teacher, which I know you once wrote in, I think, There Is No Theory of Everything, about a teacher you had,
Yes.
I had a fantastic teacher.
A New Yorker was my teacher, yeah.
Who was one of my teachers in my classes, and I think he must have kind of had this feeling that he knew what was going on with me. So, but I'm in the classes and my eyes are bugging out, and like the walls are starting to shift, and he goes, "Oh, artists like this, these things happen all the time. Don't worry about it. Just keep working, And I'm like freaking out, It's like, holy shit, this is really what artists do, It's like this is my moment, But so I'm thinking to myself, I have to keep photographing. So I keep photographing, and these are the photographs that I took, and clearly I'm just sinking into the abyss.
Yeah.
So, and that's, I have to say, it's kind of extraordinary to all of a sudden to be able to photograph exactly what you're going through at the time. Because so many writers write about the abyss, but they write it from a different perspective. They've had time to get away from it. Do you know what I'm saying? So this is the actualization of the moment that this happened. So that's was really something that was interesting and powerful, because all of a sudden, in this 5-year period, all of a sudden I realized that there is no real self. That if you really dig within yourself, all you're going to do is find an abyss. You'll go sliding right down, And which after I finished these photographs, all of a sudden I'm realizing, well, I'm kind of done. Now what am I supposed to do? And so I'm like freaking out because I'm kind of finished with my project and everything is just still kind of collapsing. And so I actually happened to had cut my finger working. I was working at the school at the time. I cut my finger. The woman said, well, what's going on? You cut your finger. Your eyes are bugging out of your head. You're not sleeping. She sent me to a psychiatrist. I was put on some medication, and I had said, I'm freaking out. I'm going back to DC where my parents were living. I'm going to live there for a month. And we got back down there, met a very nice psychiatrist, put me on some medication. Everything settled out. I'm thinking, okay, well, I can handle all this. I'll go back to school in January. So I basically missed about a month of school right there. So for that 1 month, I'm freaking out. There really is no bedrock of the soul. So and it really was kind of one of those things where it really kind of it flipped me out because I spent 5 years of my life working on this, and all of a sudden realized that there's nothing there. And my parents, or at least my father, said if you really have a problem, just find a book and figure it out. So so we kind of had a fairly extensive library, I guess, and so I was not feeling great. I was perusing around in my house, and I ran across Jean-Paul Sartre as being a nothingness,
right.
Which is how I fell into studying continental philosophy.
Right.
It was not nobody said, oh, you need to study continental philosophy.
It was that edition.
This is the edition from, it was like 1964. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So, and what happened was I'm reading it along, and do you mind if I just read a little quote from it?
No, please.
And I'm reading it along, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm kind of getting this, but it's Simon, this is not easy stuff. Right? I'm freaking out. I'm on medication, and I'm reading along, and I'm at page, 122, and it says here, thus the consciousness of belief and belief are one and the same being, the characteristic of which is absolute immanence. Okay, but as soon as we wish to grasp this being, it slips between our fingers, and we find ourselves faced with a pattern of duality, with a game of reflections. For consciousness is a reflection, qua reflection. And I was thinking to myself, well, the moment I touched this thing, that's exactly what happened. I got caught into this it was a game of reflections. It was all of a sudden like I'm flashing back and forth. And I'm thinking to myself, well, here's he's saying it, but the object has slipped between your fingers. That's what he just told me. The moment you touch it, it slips between your fingers, and I'm thinking to myself, well, the object has to come back at some point. We all know what the object is. How is it that it could have slipped between your fingers? So, and then it goes on, let us note that the term in itself, which we have borrowed from a tradition to designate the transcending being, is inaccurate. At the limit of coincidence with itself, in fact, the self vanishes to give place to identical being. The self cannot be a property of being itself. By nature, it is a reflective, a syntax sufficiently indicates, in particular rigor of Latin syntax with a strict distinction imposed by grammar, and it goes on, it refers precisely to the subject. It indicates a relation between the subject and itself, and this relation is precisely a duality, but a particular duality since it requires particular verbal symbols. And so I'm thinking to myself, well, where am I? So you've written about the nihilism and...
Yes, I mean, the way it was explained to me, I remember when I was an undergraduate and I went through some similar things that you went through. We could talk about that. The book is called Being and Nothingness.
Yeah.
There are two categories, being and nothingness. There are things that are, these things, and these things they're in themselves. And then there's us. And are we things like these things that are? No. Who are we? We're kind of nothing. So Sartre makes a distinction between things that are in themselves, like a table or a chair or a banana, and things that are for themselves, that have what we loosely call consciousness. And those are the two domains of existence. And when we have the idea of God, we imagine a being that unifies both. It's both in itself an actual substance, real, and who creates us as beings who have reflection. But for Sartre, God doesn't exist. Therefore, the last words of the book, man is a useless passion. In the sense in which we're constantly striving for something that would be substantial. When you're talking about, the question, who am I? And when we expect that the answer to that question is going to be, I am this, I'm this, my being consists in this substance, which would have been in a religious worldview, the soul, which was created by God. Once that drops out of the picture, as it does for Sartre, then we're just left with this activity of reflection, this activity of thinking, which is nothing. And the self which is doing that thinking is also nothing, which on the one hand sounds quite miserable. On the other hand, for Sartre, that's the nature of human freedom. Right? It's by virtue of not being a banana or a glass that we are the things that we are. And we are those things that are free and are constantly striving for something, trying to enact our potentiality to make an effect on the world. So it's not miserable at all. It's in Sartre you get this profound affirmation of freedom, which is so. To come back to, what you were thinking and feeling, there's a couple of thoughts I've got. I mean, the first thought is, I felt, and I imagine other people here felt similar things, particularly at that stage in a life where you, the grounds for certainty that you had, whether that is through some religious identity or through some, whatever it might be. And this, what's important then about this this work is its dyadic structure.
Exactly.
So, to throw the ball back to you, how do you say something about that? Because that seems to be really important to what you're doing.
When I was doing a portrait of myself as a young New Yorker, I had already I felt this gap within me, which is kind of set up this dyadic within me, and so 3 to 6 months later, after I'm starting to, all of a sudden I'm starting to feel better, and I'm thinking to myself, well, I'm starting to feel a little bit even elevated, and I'm starting to feel a lightness in myself, and I got myself a new camera and I started taking portraits of people, and all of a sudden I'm taking pictures, and the pictures that I'm taking, everybody has kind of this stony faced smile on their face, and, I'm thinking to myself, well, I said, okay, so this is, I did, kind of, 4 months later, I'm starting to feel, better, and so I'm taking these pictures, and all of a sudden, I'm taking maybe for 2 or 3 years, and I'm thinking, I go to my psychiatrist and say, I'm really feeling much better, I'll go off the medicine now, and everything like that, and he says, okay, you can do that, and everything like that, and so. For 2 or 3 years, I'm like thinking I got this kind of like Zen thing going on, having like feeling pretty good, and all of a sudden, I'm working several jobs. I'm trying to support myself. I'm freelancing as a photographer. I'm making a living as a bartender, and I'm working someplace else. So there's a lot of tension and everything like that, and I'm like really starting to freak out.
Right.
And all of a sudden, within a period of a day or two, I'm living on 6th Avenue and 30th, and there's a big plate glass window And all of a sudden, and honestly, you know, I got off the medicine, but at nighttime I'm having little voices in my head, but it's still thinking, yeah, it's all right. I kind of can handle this, you know. But 2 years have passed, and all of a sudden, I'm like, really, like, there's tension in me. And it's just, I'm not feeling my kumbaya anymore. And all of a sudden, within one day, it felt like I was literally thrown through the plate glass and thrown onto the street. And all of a sudden, the real world just came blasting into my head. And from that moment on, and it was actually this particular photograph, if I find is right here. Within two weeks of this photograph right here, that was the last time I ever photographed anybody with a stony faced smile. It just disappeared, never again. And honestly, never had a hallucination again. Whatever it is that I experienced, whatever elevation I felt, whatever zen I felt, whatever warmth, disappeared. And I was literally back, the closest I could ever find was Heidegger's being thrown in the world type of thing, you know.
Right.
And that was really kind of, and that's how I kind of did not become a Buddhist, but instead kind of got stuck with, you know, continental philosophy. I'm back to my, you know, there's all kind of anxiety again, like, well, there's still this kind of gap inside of me, and we went back. So the dyadic was still there.
Right.
You know, there was still kind of like this hole, you know, this kind of lack that was in you, and you felt that the forces within you, and you could reduce the gap by simply reducing everything to the same. And I was doing geometric paintings,
Right.
where during this kind of like feel-good period of my life, where I was kind of like doing a painting of a positive, and then doing the exact painting as a slight negative, only slightly forward. So you had this kind of reflection, you know, of going back and forth, and you had this kind of like, the gap was brought to a minimum distance.
Right.
You know, and that was kind of like very, you're kind of there, you know, in that moment of being like that. And all of a sudden I was thrown in, and the gap kind of got ripped apart again. And all of a sudden I'm thinking to myself, well, I can't, you know, pretend that everything is kind of in this harmony of this back and forth, you know, just flipping back and forth like a minimalist, you know, with a slight gap in it, you know. And so, so that's how I started with the
dyadic.
The dyadic was taken in 1983, but I went back to it and I said, well, you know, clearly, you know, I just always went back to that photograph and said, clearly there's the spaces in between is still there, but now I needed to kind of open that space up and really kind of figure out, well, what is this space? You know, I didn't have a language for it. You know, there was, and you could, you know, I could say Derrida's différence to everybody in the world, but nobody knows what the hell I'm talking about. So it was kind of like, I was starting to read more and more of continental philosophy, and we're talking now in this is 83, 87, 88, you know, I'm still, you know, I'm not like exactly that smart or, you know, about continental philosophy, and like I have to figure all these things out myself, you know. So that's how I started with these the hybrid paintings, you know, much earlier. You know, that really was, you know, a repetition and the flow in between, and there's always that gap, you know, and so that really was kind of where it was at.
But how do the three books relate to each other? So you've got this,
Well,
the Portrait of the Artist of New Yorker. You described that
Right.
in the letter you sent me as a loop. You described that.
Right, exactly. This is a
Which
loop, so
is
it kind of starts, you know,
Smile.
yeah, there's a smile on the end, then all of a sudden it comes back down again. So if you can see that, yeah, so I've retained some kind of sense of self, but if you could kind of see it as a loop, then I'm kind of started back at the same place again. I decided to go back to school and I realized that I really needed to learn how to use a computer. You know, I really didn't know how to use it, so I need to learn how to use an Apple and Photoshop and all those things because the world was becoming digital. So at the same time, I said, well, I'm going to, you know, do another book. Joel and I produced this book. He said, you know, and I'm reading Derrida, and I'm thinking, you know, I'm pretty smart. I can read Derrida type of thing. And he says, well, you know, have you read Heidegger? I said, really? Do I have to read Heidegger? I'm kind of done with Derrida. You know, it's kind of like, what do I need to read more? And so it was literally him said, you know, well, you really should read some Heidegger because that's where Derrida comes from. You know, if you're going to make the effort to try to learn these things, then try to understand it from Heidegger's perspective. So I started reading Being in Time, and like I said, I don't have anybody really to talk about it. Joel has suggested it, and that's how this book came about. Was the question of authenticity, and that really was, and it was kind of really wasn't that sure about it. You kind of had to kind of like figure it out, and it was maybe after there was something in there about authenticity in Blue Skies and Windows. But the idea was, are you the event or are you the reflection event? And the difference was between being hounded and haunted. The difference was running away from your experience, your death experience, or should you be, because from Heidegger's perspective is that you should be going back to it. You should face your experience. And that was an authentic way. So being hounded wasn't authentic, being haunted was. Facing it, going back toward it, would be a more authentic way of comporting yourself. If that makes sense, I think. Right? And that's how I was really questioning authenticity. Which one's more authentic? And I couldn't, for me, hounded and haunted, both of them seem pretty authentic. How could you be haunted if you weren't hounded in the first place? So that's how this book came about, and kind of left, authenticity, kind of just let it go. I have no idea what being authentic means in today's world. But that was my attempt to grapple. It was my question. What's more authentic? So.
Well, I mean, let's talk a little bit about, because in the letter you sent me, which I got, this is you, is being authentic hounded or haunted?
Right.
And is running away from the anxiety of an existential event more authentic than being pulled back to the same event?
Right.
The end result for me, for you, was that I do have a certain fidelity to the gap, but no formula for authenticity. And this is very interesting because, philosophy is not difficult in the sense in which it's working with very simple sets of intuitions about the way things are, and then trying to find conceptual structures to describe them that are formulated into books. But the basic intuitions are very simple. And with Heidegger, Heidegger's thesis in Being in Time, that he repeats over and over again, is that Dasein is being in the world. We're in the world, right? So his first thought is that we are in the world. And a blindingly simple-minded, obvious thought, and that our being in the world is what is fundamental. So, but once you begin with that thought, then we might want to think, for example, many people do think, that our fundamental way of being in the world is given to us by the discoveries of natural science. Right? Our being in the world is a function of our brain, or something like that. And Heidegger wants to not reject those thoughts, but to say our first access to things, the way in which the world shows up, is experientially. It shows up as this ensemble of experiences I have, and from which I do not initially distinguish myself. I'm in there with stuff. So think about, when you were an infant or something, and you will, or the experience of play when you're a kid, and the way in which you can be lost completely in the activity. You're there with things, you're building blocks or whatever it might be. With me it was Lego. And you're there with the things. And so we're fundamentally being in the world. And so philosophy for Heidegger has to begin from this average, everyday insight into our being in the world, which again, it seems like a perfectly obvious thing to say, but philosophers before that time hadn't said it, funnily enough. He describes that being in the world as inauthentic. And by that he insists he's not making a moral judgment, not saying inauthentic as bad, just inauthentic in the sense in which, for example, when you first wake up in the morning, right? You ask yourself, well, how did you find yourself this morning? I just rolled back the sheets and there I was. There you are. You're in, or when, before you're conscious, you are with things. You're unreflectively with stuff, with that room, with that environment. And you're not, as it were, a proper self at that point. Right? You are with stuff. And that is what Heidegger described as inauthentic existence, which is not a moral judgment, he insists. So, if that's the case, if we are fundamentally of the same stuff as the world, and fundamentally of the same stuff as other people, how does the self emerge?
Mm-hmm.
And then, in Heidegger's Being in Time tells this extraordinary story about, the way I like to describe it is in terms of the precipitation of the self. It's as if in our inauthentic everyday lives, it's like imagine being submerged underwater. We're submerged in a kind of a warm sea, and we feel no distinction between the water and our bodies. We're being fish at that point, right? Remember, we are fish, and some of those fish made a choice to go back to the ocean. It has to be respected. The whales took a look at this and said, no, we're going back. And anyway, but then the tide goes out. The tide goes out, and the self begins to form. The self begins to precipitate. And for Heidegger, the fundamental mood in which the self precipitates is anxiety. Mm-hmm. Anxiety is that sense of the familiar, everyday, ordinary becoming unfamiliar, strange, and odd. And anxiety is that kind of quivering in us that opens some other experience. And Heidegger wants to say that anxiety, which pulls us away from the world, allows something like a self to first precipitate. Mm-hmm. So we can say that there's that kind of paradise that maybe some of us existed in. I think I can remember existing in, the kind of the counterfeit immortality of infancy. Mm-hmm. When you're young and you think the thought of death doesn't really cross your mind. You're going to live forever. Sure. And then at a certain point, however it might arise through the death of a parent or someone that you love, death enters into the world. Mm-hmm. And then you realize that you're mortal too, and that you're death-bound. So that sense of anxiety, that sense of that quivering anxiety is also bound up with the experience of our mortality, our sense of ourselves as going towards death. And Heidegger's point, which I still agree, there's lots of questions I have about Heidegger, but I still agree with this, is that that being towards death is essential to what it means to be human. Mm-hmm. And so, what makes a culture like most Western culture, particularly the United States, so odd, as other people have pointed out in the past, is its denial of death, its inability to look death in the face. And you can tell this from, say, the positioning of cemeteries in cities like New York. Where are the cemeteries? They're out there in Queens. They're somewhere a long way. Death. Nobody dies here. Death is what other people experience. We're going to be fine. And when they die, we'll shove them out there. I mean, it seems to me that what makes this society so different from other societies, and most societies that we call traditional, is that at the centre of those societies was the presence of the dead, right? And one's connection with the dead, which is what religion was all about. One's connection, say, with the ancestors, however that might have been articulated, was essential to the continuation of life here. So one's life here was connected with one's own mortality and the mortality of those people that had come before. And that's not a negative thing. That's a kind of wonderful thing.
Sure.
Right? And so so for Heidegger, the self begins to take shape in this experience of anxiety and death, and the other thing he talks about is conscience, this sense of being, the strange experience of bad conscience. Say, for example, when you feel appalled at yourself, shameful for what you've done. And what does that shame reveal about the self?
Mm-hmm.
How does the self pull away from itself in the experience of shame, which some people experience, but Donald Trump doesn't experience, right? Donald Trump, in a sense, is essentially a creature without shame in a really important way. He's still human, observably, but without that fundamental mechanism of shame.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what, and it's that anyway, so there's that. And, but does this story that Heidegger tells, and that I'm telling a version of it, because I believe much of it is of great value, though there are questions about much of it as well. Does this answer your question, your initial question, as a young New Yorker, the who am I question?
Mm-hmm.
And is authenticity then something that we can achieve as a permanent state?
Mm-hmm.
And Heidegger's answer to that is no.
Mm-hmm.
We can momentarily, in certain moments, achieve what he calls a mastery of the everyday, where we can see things clearly for what they are.
Mm-hmm.
And at those points we can be briefly proper ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
By authenticity, Heidegger just means being one's own, being what is proper as a human being. The term in German is less moral in that sense. And then it slips away,
Mm-hmm.
and then you're sucked back into
Mm-hmm.
inauthentic everyday life. So to be human, this is kind of what I'm coming to in relationship to your work. To be human is to inhabit that gap
Mm-hmm.
between inauthentic
Mm-hmm.
everyday life, immersed in the kind of water of existence, and the pulling away from that
Mm-hmm.
in moments of authenticity. But there's no resolution to that.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. I think,
agree, don't they?
yeah. Well, again, it's that's something else, But
Mm-hmm.
to go back to this book, and we'll talk about Root in a section. How I got to Root was
Yes.
In Blue Skies and Windows. There was a lot of in the very beginning. There was a lot of willing going on. So when I was reading it again, I was thinking to myself. And I remember reading Nietzsche at the time, kind of a will to power.
Mm-hmm.
And you're kind of starting with absolutely nothing. So you have to you have to start with, you have to will yourself. You have to use real will to get back going again. And
Mm-hmm.
you have to reframe yourself. You have to find a frame for yourself and say, well, this is my frame that I'm working with.
Mm-hmm.
So this were my hybrid paintings, and that was my frame. And that's how I came up with the images in this book. Was that there was kind of this free-flowing thing going on in Blue Skies, where I'm just kind of tumbling around, and there's this kind of willing myself back to power, willing myself into becoming something, becoming anything, but just having a sense of self again, which I lost in the abyss. So that's fine, and that's being hounded. Being haunted, on the other hand, I thought had a fair amount of ego in it. You're like, well, I have a sense of self. I'm feeling good about myself. I'm going to go back. I feel strong, and I'll go back to try to get back to this original moment. And so there was this kind of ego that was going on in Windows, which I kind of liked. It was kind of like the will to power. Why I write such great books. It's kind of like you have a sense of you have a certain sense. So I'm thinking about how I came to Root was, obviously I saw these Root pictures and they were fantastic.
Yeah.
But if you did get back to that original moment of the kind of death-like experience that you had, what would the difference be between something that happened in 1983 or almost 20 years later? I think it's 2006. So literally, I took the photograph, and I pulled it apart. And so I kind of, deconstructed it. I said, well, all right, this is the moment. I've been reflecting on this for 20 years, type of thing, and let me get to the root. That's why it's not called Roots. This is the root. This is my experience, my death-like experience. I've been hounded by it. I'm haunted back at. Now I'm back at this moment. What is it? Is it a religious experience? And I decided, well, it is an abyss. It simply is an abyss. Yeah, there is something that all. That you experience that elevates you, but at the end of the day, it's an abyss. So if you're going to go looking for your true self, as far as I'm concerned, you're going to run into abyss. And you're gonna be annihilated. There's not gonna be anything left of you. You're gonna be very miserable, and you're gonna be like freaking out because all of a sudden you spend all this time and effort, trying to get to the bottom of who you are and realize that there is no bottom line to who you are.
Right.
And that was the basis of Root. It was kind of like just getting rid of the kind of the ego about it, and really it is about getting rid of letting go of being hounded and haunted, letting go of the idea of being authentic, letting go of spiritual feelings, all to try to get, well, what is it really all about then? If you really forget about the the actualization of the event, when you've made the effort to think about it, and then you say, well, this is not it, this is not it, this is not it. What happens when you finally get to kind of that original moment? And it's an abyss, and that's what it is, and so that's how Root came about. And I kind of what I liked about it was that it had the kind of raw power to it of really returning to this original moment. And
do you find in that sense of the abyss a comfort of some kind as well, or as a realization?
It was more of a realization.
Okay.
You're way too freaked out, as an actualization of an event, and you're like, you need to, really get control of yourself. You need to pull everything back together again. But it's only upon reflection that you realize, well, if you're really, it's that kind of comfort. Well, the gap is real. So
we are the gap.
Yeah, we are, and so you read all these kind of, it's not like like the Woody Allen movie. Like I'm sitting there reading all these books, and all of a sudden I can pull you out of a corner, and say, Simon, is it really a gap?
Or the Marshall McLuhan moment in Annie Hall.
Exactly. So all the, you had to kind of figure it out for yourself. Which is what being an artist is about. You have these fundamental questions, but you realize that life does not give you ultimate objects. There is no theory of everything, and that's it's profound if you experience it. It's also profound to think about it, because it changes the way you think about the world. And so that dyadic structure has always stayed with my work, simply because I think. The gap is fundamental to our nature. It is our fundamental nature. And I also think it's natural. I don't think it's unnatural. So if you're going to go looking for...
Natural in what sense? You mean
natural in that if you're going to go looking for yourself, you're going to run into an abyss.
Okay.
That's what's going to happen. You're not, and you may experience religious experiences and everything like that, and you may decide that you're going to become a monk and all those things.
Yep.
But the abyss comes first.
Yep.
That's what's fundamental, at least from my perspective. And that was profound to me, because it changed the way I thought about the world, because the gap will always be there. And in the art world, especially if you look at somebody like Mondrian or the Russian constructivists, they had this synthesis. That a Mondrian painting, you have a sense that here is this object, and he has it. He captured it. So, the truth is that, can you capture the object, or like the minimalists? I never heard a minimalist say, "Well, the object slipped between my fingers." The object actually does slip between your fingers. We don't have it, and that is as an artist is really profound. Not to mention trying to sell that to Skoto. So anyway, that came was the real formal realization. What happened in Root.
You've got this formulation, I'm trying to find it, where it's the, this is in the, I think it's in the press release. So there's no synthesis in art, that's an illusion, but we can figure the impossible, you say.
Right.
Figuring, so these works would be literal kind of figurations.
Figuring the impossible, because there's always that space in between. So to figure the impossible is literally to try to not so much think about it, but well, how do you figure it? If the true nature of our existence can't be represented, then how do you figure that? That's what the challenge is of being an artist, I think, at least if you take this seriously. And the books help me take it seriously.
How do you imagine a kind of ideal audience see, when they see your work, what do you imagine them seeing and feeling?
Really, what I imagine, life can't give us ultimate answers, and it should be taught, at the most elementary kind of grade school level, is that none of us can have ultimate answers, and it's great for you to go to church and all those other things, and get a sense of an internal sense of yourself. But as soon as you walk out of the church, there's a gap between you and the other church. So unless you become aware of this gap on an everyday basis, I don't think, as we're still living in this world of either or, which is Trump's world. It's kind of like either you're on my side or you're not, type of thing. So unless people are starting to realize that, then, there's a real danger.
This is when in the introduction, you talked about the gap as part of a vernacular that could be a bulwark against.
Right.
We're stuck with an idea of the ego of the leader, the ego of political figures or whatever it might be, and linked to that a kind of every political figure, like what's happening in Alabama at the moment, is kind of defensive structure.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
A fortification against what you're calling the gap. If you began a different place, if you began with a different anthropology, that human beings are these beings that inhabit this anxious gap that doesn't add up, and we are dependent creatures. We live in a precarious situation. We're vulnerable creatures. We're creatures that are fundamentally open and kind of hounded and haunted. If you begin your thinking about morals and politics from there, you end up in a very different place. Now, the question I have for you, the question for me as well, is in all this landscape you've been describing so richly and you've been figuring in the work, what about love? So if we accept, let's accept what we both said, right? Let's say we're both right. There's this anxiety in the formation of selfhood. There's this gap that opens up that can't be resolved through some notion of authenticity. We have to learn to acknowledge that, accept that. Is there in that experience a space for a transformative act of love in relationship to another person? Obviously, the way in which the tradition has largely thought about that love is in relationship to love of God.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
If we say we're not sure about that, can that transformative experience take place through the experience of love to another human, or what do you think about that?
But in Blue Skies and Windows, I pick up a couple of lines from Derrida, and it says, we begin with love. And I was actually thinking about this, the experience between the abyss and then this kind of, and Jean-Luc Marion uses the term of oversaturation, this kind of, this feeling of and there's almost like a feeling of love that comes over you. But that's 3 or 4 months later, so there's this kind of absolutely horrible existential experience that you experience, and then you have this feeling of lightness and airiness and love that you experience, and it is there in your stony-faced smile. I believe, we need the other, not the big other, but the other. We need the other to help us figure, if you're going to be in an abyss, you need the other to help you get through it. And so it is only through, it's when you can love the other, that it really does give you a better frame through the history of being, is what I call the history of being. I'm reading these books and things like that, and I'm feeling something, a certain warmth inside of me. I'm feeling different, enough to say, thanks, I don't need the medication anymore and everything like that. So it's fine. It lasted for almost 2 or 3 years, like I said, and that was really, I had a very kind of it was a long enough experience, that it was day in and day out, and I had this kind of, the apples tasted better, and it was this kind of, really was a little spring in my feet, and I had a little kind of like glow to me too, whatever that was, and you can't, say exactly what it was. All I can say is that if you look at the, like, I'm looking at something that's now back 30 years ago. I'm taking pictures of the sun. I'm taking pictures of these, people with stony-faced smiles. So there's something going on where, I don't have a spiritual bone in my body before this thing happened. So it's all within you, and then of course it ended, just like that, and honestly, that's where I kind of had to stand up and say, well, I just got screwed again. Because first I had the kind of like, annihilation of the self. Then I experienced this kind of, elevation or whatever spiritual experience I had without having any spiritual, background or anything like that. And this certain, a feeling of love for the other, and then all of a sudden it was gone. And at that point I realized you better start having a real sense of humor, because it's kind of like, well, it's pretty funny now, because it's kind of like you got up, you think you kind of, oh yeah, I'm feeling pretty good. I had the little kumbaya moment, it's lasting for a few years. I'm thinking I'll start studying Buddhism on a regular basis. Maybe I'll join a monastery or something like that. And instead, it just kind of disappears. And I think faith, I think that's where faith has to come in, but it didn't come in for me. What came in for me was, reading, Samuel Beckett, reading Kurt Vonnegut, finding people that really are funny,
I noticed you did the dedication to portrait of myself as a New Yorker young New Yorker is dedicated to the ones who take themselves too seriously.
That's right, exactly.
And that's meant to be funny in a way.
Exactly, yeah. But it was, I had to stop taking myself so seriously, and it was kind of like I had to stop thinking that I'm treading on water, not treading on water, but I have to stop thinking of myself as kind of like this Zen guy, and like really, it's kind of, no, you're just, you're there every day in the world, which is absurd. Every day in this, back to this kind of anxiety of like, that the gap opened up again. So.
And then humor can be a kind of, the way I think of it is that humor has the same formal structure as depression, but can be experience deployed as a kind of antidepressant, in the sense in which there's this great joke that it's not a very funny joke, but it's still a great joke that Freud tells in his essay on humour, and it's a man who's been condemned to death. He's going to be hanged at the gallows, and on the morning of his execution, he leaves his cell, accompanied by the prison guards. Walks out to into the courtyard. There's the gallows ahead of him. Turns to the prison guard and says, "Well, the week's beginning nicely." Na die Woche fängt gut an. Right? And Freud says, why is this funny? Because the man is condemned to die, and he's going to die.
Sure.
Yet he's capable at that moment of this act of humour, whereby he looks at himself from outside of himself and finds himself ridiculous. Right. And in that finding yourself ridiculous, you experience the words Freud uses, elevation and liberation, of a kind of minimal kind, not of a dramatic kind, but of a significant kind. So I think of humour as a practice that, and again, what interests me is that this is what we do. We tell jokes, or we find things funny with each other, and when someone sort of puffs themselves up too much, you can deflate them with a gag, right? And this is why friends are important, because they can remind you of what a ridiculous creature you are, and we're all ridiculous creatures. But in that, there's a sense in which you are taking yourself seriously, you're not taking yourself seriously. Humour is that antidepressant that comes out of a kind of melancholic sense of who we are, but allows us to acknowledge that, to embrace it with others. Also, humour is a social practice. You can laugh at jokes on your own, but you can also laugh at jokes with other people. And I think that's a really important thing, which is often misunderstood. But and love, yeah. I mean, we're so wrong about love, it seems to me, that if we begin from this idea of the self, as, imagine that we're these neatly packaged egos, and we go out into the world in galleries in Chelsea, and here we are. And then, what would love be? Love would be where one of these neatly packaged egos meets another neatly packaged ego, and they decide that they'll hook up. Or eventually, when things get really serious, they'll move in, and when really, really serious, they'll buy real estate together. Right? And that's love as a kind of mutual exchange of favors. And love in our culture has been reduced to this kind of operation whereby me and I want someone like me, not like, but someone that I'm attracted to, we can kind of fit together into a bad dyad. And it seems to me that love is something completely different from that. Love has to begin with an experience of self-excoriation, a kind of emptying of the self, which is why the religious traditions are still so powerful, because that's what's going on there. I mean, and it's only if we begin with that idea of a self in terms of this gap, then love becomes a quite different proposition, I think. And it would be nice to think that things are getting better, except they're not. And that idea of love as a mutual exchange of favors, if you think about that in relationship to, just think about online dating for a little bit, that's enough. And you get the picture, right? Because you are that picture, you are that picture, that image of yourself that you present and has to be preserved, and it's that's apparently going to fall in love with someone else that works. And that's just the wrong place to start, because it's the wrong idea of the self to begin with. So if we begin somewhere else, we might end up in a better place, I guess would be my thought. What should we talk about now?
Well, the last thing was after I finished Root.
I'd like to know the development of the work from there to what we're seeing on the wall.
Well, some of these
talk us through.
Most of these are all these hybrid paintings are really all based on the idea of the dyad, and it really is based on the idea of repetition and difference. But I really started with in 1988 with these hybrid paintings when the stony faced smile all of a sudden disappeared. That before that, like I said, I was doing geometric paintings that the gap was brought to a minimum distance. So one of the things about the gap is because we're fundamentally free, we can also expand the gap and contract it to however we feel our needs are. If we're really feeling totally out of it, that we have no sense of self, then maybe what you need to do is pull the gap together, reduce everything to a minimum distance, and have and get kind of a sense of yourself again. It's only when you feel somewhat confident in yourself that that you can let it go. You don't have to be that uptight about it. And when I decided that I wasn't going to follow a kind of that minimalist venue of doing these abstract paintings, that I decided that I would try to pull it open a little bit and try to understand this thing in between better. And that's where I started actually photographing from the television set. And it was actually during the early days of VHS, where you could photograph, stop it, and I was starting to photograph early cartoons like Donald Duck and things. And it's really where I started looking at having a sense of humor in my work. And that goes back to the 88, where these literally I would take pictures of Donald Duck on the television, and then the three of them together, and then have this repetition. So on the one hand, you have this kind of cinema, of the cinematic photograph, which is running this way, and time is flowing by. So that's how the street photographs came back into it, and some of the other paintings have more gears in them, and things like that. The loopy painting over there was really based on all these books that I was doing were based on loops. So it was kind of like this flowing up and then coming right back again. And Skiz Flow was more of an experience of just your head just kind of exploding out from So those things, it was able to capture in the dyad things that I was experiencing that I couldn't do in photography, that I couldn't do in these books, like Skizflow and Loopy or. And then
the one around here, this one with
the big photograph over there is literally, I'm not, I'm doing all this work and everything like that, and it's not like there's, people having, less, nobody's looking at my painting and says, oh, difference, the gap, I get it, let's have a show type of thing. Nobody knows what the hell I'm talking about. So what is my drive? Why am I doing this, after all these years? And there's something about Lacanian jouissance that talks about, you keep driving at it, you keep going at it, without actually resolving it. So why is it that I'm having this drive? So the whole idea of it, I'm thinking to myself, why am I doing this? I'm not getting anywhere. I'm not making any, major achievements or anything like that. So I used the car portrait as a metaphor for a drive. So all these car portraits, and so it really was, the guy Kevin was a driver, but he can't say what it is. It's, and I think the language that I used was at the time was the unsayable, the unnameable, which I used over and over again, which was clearly from Beckett.
Right.
So, what is it that you can't say? Well, there's that space in between, which is what the little thing is, and it's split. Between, you see the two lines going in two different directions. So you go down and the line splits. So you go into this unified space and you go off into two totally different directions. So that's how the whole kind of thing about it was. And I do relate to it kind of as Heidegger's Gelassenheit, which means letting be. Because on the one hand, in portrait, I had this kind of like, all right, I had a spiritual experience and then I didn't. So I let it go. I had this ideas about authenticity, and they were both kind of not, I'm not sure which one was authentic. So I stopped thinking about authenticity. In root, it was like trying to get really get to the root of the thing.
Right.
And then I was kind of like, I was nothing left to let go of. Whatever ego there was, just wasn't that important anymore. So I kind of think there's a difference to be made between letting go and letting be. And that's what I've been thinking about for the last number of years, at least with my photography, is that what's the difference between letting go of something and arriving at that moment and just letting it be? So the gap is there. I don't have to argue with it anymore. It's here. We're having a conversation about it. I know that I've done everything that I can to express the gap. Maybe it's just time to let it be and to listen. And I think there is something about Heidegger in there. Without Heidegger, quite honestly, he's not giving you an answer.
No.
But there is something to be said about, and that also puts you right into the realm of Eastern philosophy. So I'm never going to become a Buddhist. But there is always that thing where the tension. You want that tension in your space. It keeps you alive. Bringing everything too close together, I think everything gets a little too self-satisfied with your own little group of people, It's kind of like, so having that tension with the other, I think is probably a healthy thing. But that's kind of the things which I'm thinking about. And that kind of little bit of anxiety is not a bad thing. A little bit of anxiety is not going to kill you.
No, it's going to keep you alive.
Right.
And the Gelassenheit, this idea of letting be or releasement.
Right.
Releasement, it sometimes is a term that Heidegger picks up from the great German medieval theological thinker Meister Eckhart, the sermons of Meister Eckhart, where releasement is their releasement towards the divine in the very strange way that Eckhart formulates it, but Heidegger wants to rethink it as releasement or letting be towards things. It's Gelassenheit zu den Dingen, so to be open and let go towards things. So as it were, the fundamental attitude being an attitude of kind of maintaining an openness is kind of what he's hinting at and if we could do that, for example, in relationship to the environment, that would also be a fundamental change, but we seem a long way from that. And there was nothing I was going to say, but I think I'll let it go. What's interesting about the books and the work is the way in which you're, with, I think it's the sincerity of the work, the sincerity of the work, because a way we often think about artists, particularly contemporary artists, is in terms of a kind of ironic, defensive structure. Right? There's the work, which is taking place with multiple levels of irony and conceit and references to other work, behind which the artist kind of retreats to emerge, either drunk or rich or just saying obscure things or saying, self-indulgent things. And there's a kind of sincerity in the project that each of these books is a kind of working through of a problem which you've worked through and then moved on to the next elaboration of it, which is what we're seeing here. I think it's amazing. So we should let the people have a...
Sure.
Yeah.
I have a question from Gary Gutting.
All right. Okay.
He said, will philosophy and art turn out, he was asking you, do you think, will philosophy and art turn out to be on the opposite sides of the absolute gap or different expressions of it?
Different expressions of it.
Okay. I'll let him know.
That's easy. Also, once I was in a boutique in Paris about 20 years ago, and I saw Laurent Bacall.
Oh wow!
It was Agnes Bay. Before Agnes Bay became like a really big brand, there was a couple of stores in Paris, and my girlfriend was buying some clothes. I was just standing there, and in walked Laurent Bacall, and I thought, that's Laurent Bacall. And I seen an interview with her because she'd just been promoting her autobiography, and so it was an interview with her on British television, and I didn't do anything for about 5 minutes. She just moved around the store looking at things. She was wearing a trouser suit, but she was visibly her, and so I tentatively walked over to her, and she realised immediately what was going on. And I said, "Are you?" Before I could finish it, yes, I am. And that was it.
That's right.
And it was a wonderful way to deal with it. Because
Sure.
imagine, because she was, 21 when she was in that movie?
Yeah.
She was so young when she was in those movies with Bogart. And there's a self. There's a gap. Imagine that gap.
Yeah.
Imagine that your being is defined by that everyone loves and admires, and then you're this intelligent, articulate woman within that.
Sure. Yeah.
The prison of that structure. That must be something else. So over to you.
Any questions?
You were asking yourself the question, who am I? Was that something that came to you spontaneously, or you posed the question to yourself? And if you did pose it to yourself, why were you asking the question? To make you a better person, or to help you in your work?
No, I had not even become an artist, and then I had noticed a reason to become an artist was, like I was saying, was that I grew up speaking 3 different languages, so I really thought, and it really wasn't a problem switching between English, Dutch, and French. The problem that I had was who was the real me, and it was easy for me to switch from a French culture to a French African culture to a Dutch culture to the American culture. But I didn't feel a real sense of self. So maybe, today, it would be, much more easy where, identities are so much more fluid, but I felt the need to have this real, concrete sense of self. So that's really how the question became in the first place. And at that point, I also bought a Nikon F and hit the road and started photographing in the late 70s and really questioning, well, who am I really, you know? So.
So it's Albert, right? So what was the, I mean, how did that question, how would you say that question arises for you?
Well,
The who am I question.
I asked the question to myself
Mm-hmm.
many times
Mm-hmm.
because it's crazy a little bit, but I tend to see myself as a hologram. I'm here, I'm there,
Mm-hmm.
and which is me? Is it
Mhm.
the person sitting here,
Mm-hmm.
or the person in my head I'm thinking about somewhere else?
Because it could be, the question who am I can be a kind of empty question, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, you think about all so many movies or TV shows that use it. It's a question that kind of presses itself, it emerges, or something emerges. You begin to experience something,
Mm-hmm.
and that then takes the form
Mm-hmm.
of a question down the line, which can be the question, who am I? But it's more the question of, you know, for me it's more the question of, who are these people? How did I end up here? You know, is that my mother? Really? What am I doing here? You know, it was like that sense of, you know,
Sure.
just feeling
Yeah, yeah.
at odds with.
Mm-hmm.
And I this is where I guess it would be. I grew up speaking one language, and my family never went anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we went to Belgium for 3 days when I was 6 years old and hated it. Never left England again. So my family was absolutely rooted, you know. But there was the same sense
Sure,
of
yeah,
bewilderment
yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
within a. I mean, so one way of answering your question, if things weren't so apparently rootless for you,
Mm-hmm.
it could have been different.
Right.
But I had a really rooted sense of who I was, but the
Mhm.
same sense of bewilderment.
Mm-hmm.
Because one way of thinking about, you know, a kind of cliche way of thinking about American experiences is there's something peculiarly rootless
Mm-hmm.
about Americanness.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. There's something about space here which is different.
Yeah.
right? And
Oh,
the
right.
way you described
Mhm.
just the spaces that you were in,
Mm-hmm.
for me, it's incalculable.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been incalculable. The first time I got on a plane when I was 25, and the idea that you would even bother to go somewhere
Mhm.
that far away still kind of bewilders me.
Mm-hmm.
I went to California last week and just think how far away that is.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you go there? why is anybody?
Yeah.
Why don't people stay where they? There's that. So the sense of maybe it exaggerates the sense of rootlessness here, but I don't know. I think you can be from a really kind of restricted environment and feel exactly the same
Mm-hmm.
things.
Oh, I totally agree. Yeah, no question. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I have a question for you.
Mhm.
You mentioned that you started out from Poland, your
Yes,
father,
mhm.
but is your mother from Poland also?
Sure. Yeah. She's totally
The
Dutch.
reason I'm asking because in psychology class there is this notion of a third culture
Mm-hmm.
child.
Mm-hmm.
So if your mother is from one culture, your
Mhm.
father is from another culture,
Right.
and you grow up
Mm-hmm.
in a third culture, such as French
Mhm.
mother, English father,
Mm-hmm.
and then you grow up in America,
Mm-hmm.
then you tend to lose that sense of self.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed to me that's what I was
Yeah.
getting out of you.
Yeah.
You know,
Um,
what's going on there.
I think it would have been fine if I'd just simply moved to the United States, because I was 6 years old. I learned the language pretty quickly within 6 months. I think it was after 2 years where I was really doing pretty well in school and getting pretty good grades. And then all of a sudden we decided to move to West Africa. And I would have been fine too if it was an American school, but there was no American school. It was only a French school. So it was literally like I just did this for 2 years before that. You know, like literally nobody speaks Dutch, you know, in this country. So it was literally like and it was like being in the French school, nobody spoke English either. So it was that kind of, which was then okay too. It was moving back for the third time and then learning how to speak English again, you know, and literally not understanding English grammar or any of those things, because those are the things you learn in 5th and 6th grade. Yeah.
Who was next?
Mm-hmm.
I get it about the triptychs
Mhm.
and the gap. How about the three images? What are they relating to within the gap?
Well, the 3 images is, I just started doing those in early 2000, and it was really going back to street photography, but it was kind of, I had done a fair amount of kind of the absurd paintings which they're not necessarily here except for maybe those two back there. But that kind of absurdness of life, and I really want to get back to kind of an everydayness, the everyday grind of our existence, and how that relates to the gap that we have to. It's not just in extreme moments, but in our everydayness, we realize there's a certain amount of disjunction in our everyday existence. And that is, in a certain sense, the tension is always there, but it's part of our everyday life. So,
It's a question.
When you were talking about the Augustine and the conversion and the loss of self in the world,
Yeah.
do you see a gap there?
Oh yeah. So So the Augustine was a kind of nightclubber turned bishop. Right? He was a fully fledged pagan with an interest in had a nice time, and he begins to fall apart. He begins to pull away from that in this experience of anxiety. So the world that he took to be his world, the world that he knew, kind of evaporated, kind of withdrew, and then the gap opens up at that point. For Augustine, the gap is filled by. He resolves it through God. Although he resolves it through God. But what interests me in conversion is that movement of that instability and that openness which happens in the experience of conversion. And the question then is, if you don't happen to believe in God the way that Augustine does, you could then say, well, all of that is nonsense, right? These people are just deluded by superstitions, and we need to get beyond that and embrace a scientific view of the world. I think that's a kind of really Philistine reaction. It also ignores that what's going on in religion for me is something really deep. Religion is an area of human practice that is articulating these deep questions. Mm-hmm. And if I can't accept the answers, personally, you can learn a great deal from the journey that people make. I think that's incredibly important. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of tendency in, there's a kind of, I don't know, how would I put that? Almost sort of atheist evangelism you can find in, say, amongst certain liberals, which is represented by a figure like Richard Dawkins or someone mm-hmm. like that. That we can get rid of all that stuff and move on, and science gives us the answer. It's that just ignores all these other rich aspects of the human adventure. That what are human beings? I mean, human beings are. We might just be like bananas when we'll find out that bananas are really much more complicated than we thought, and they've got these complex symbolic systems mm-hmm. that we have not yet discovered. Unlikely with bananas, but with whales and dolphins, who knows? Who knows? But we haven't got there yet. But with human beings, it seems to me that what's so peculiar about us is the fact that we're not instrumental, right? That we're not defined by a struggle to exist. Mm-hmm. Just that. If you could look at the earliest anthropological evidence we have from human settlements in East Africa, South Africa, and then, when people moved out of Africa, all those hundreds of thousands of years ago, from the moment that human beings gathered together in small groups, they began to symbolize their existence. They began to decorate themselves. This is incredibly ancient mm-hmm. remains that have been found somewhere on the coast in South Africa, where we find that human beings in these settlements of, let's say, 20, 30 people together, were using ochre, they were using paint to decorate themselves. They had at that point already art. They were drawing on the walls. They were why? There's no need for that. It doesn't serve any end. It's that's just what we do. We're kind of ornamental creatures, and we're creatures that create these symbolic structures. Now we call that art, and it's in the kind of I don't know, the kind of excessiveness and uselessness of that I think something really important is glimpsed for me. Bit of accompanying music there. So it's not, why did, we are, just historically. So if we're probably the least adorned people in the history of people, right? I'm interested in ancient Greek civilization, right? And I've done some thinking about this over the years and tried to read the work of historians. How did the ancient Greeks look? They wore, or I was in an Egyptian museum in Italy about a couple of months ago, and they had makeup, they had wigs, they had prosthetic devices, they had artificial phalluses, they had the most elaborate kind of robes. That's what human beings do, is that they create these extraordinary ornamental systems which articulate who they are, which usually always have a relationship to the dead, and the sense of the dead being present, and that connection with the dead as being essential to the life of a culture, right? That's kind of basic to human beings. Without that, it just doesn't seem that the human experiment gets going. If we lose a connection with the dead, the ancestors, we're lost. The crops won't grow, whatever. And that reveals something just weird about where the kind of creatures that we are. Relatively unadorned, and with a kind of blind terror of death and a real problem with the memory of that. And what that means, and I think that's a lot. That's why I want the cemeteries in the middle of the cities, right? That would be so if you're designing a new city, the first thing you put there is a cemetery with the dead who've been there, who define that place, and that's and whatever community we have has to be a community in relationship to those people, not as something. There's nothing morbid about that. It seems to me, there's something. It's the opposite of morbidity. It's affirmative, I think. The fact that we don't have ritual practices around death anymore, right? People don't know what to do. When I was growing up, before I was growing up, I'm not that old, but when men still wore hats, and there would be, a hearse would go down the street, you would stop and people would take off their hat. That doesn't mean that you knew that person, that you got any relationship, but it's a kind of, it's a ritual sign of respect of some kind. And what makes a culture is those fragile networks of practices, and which we think of as rituals. And they're incredibly important, it seems to me, in binding groups of human beings together. And we've really lost that. So when someone says, if someone you know, a friend, it's a good friend says that someone has died that they know, or their parent has died, or a child has died, or that there's been, say, a suicide or something like that, we don't know what to say, apart from a few banal words of comfort. We don't know what to do. And that's a symptom of a real crisis, I think, in who we are.
So, do you think, as a society, that we can do without religion? Because it seems to me, even as an atheist, I tend to agree.
I think I think religion is.
It's emotion.
Yeah, it's emotion. Yeah, I agree with, say, perhaps the greatest American philosopher, William James. William James, in The Varieties of Religious Experience, this extraordinary book based on the lectures he gave in Edinburgh, James wasn't religious in any obvious way, but he was fascinated with the experience of religion and what it did. And he says somewhere that something like, I can't see the world in other than religious terms. Something like that. And I tend to agree with that. That unless you understand the religious structure of experience, you're kind of lost. If you think that can just be kind of put to one side or eliminated as error, you're never going to get anywhere. So I take, so therefore in a country like the United States, you have to begin, I think, with the phenomenon of religion in all of its astonishing, strange diversity. As much as you might find that puzzling. It's what this place is. It's an extraordinary religious experiment. As well as being capitalism and commercialism and all of that. There's that too, but there's these other strands which have to be kind of brought out and acknowledged. That's why I'm interested in sport. Particularly soccer or football, because if you're looking for religion,
You'll find it there.
you find it there. You find it there in all of its awful complexity. What is national identity in relationship to a football team? What is local identity? What is that? And there's some nasty stuff going on there, but really important stuff, and it has to be kind of thought through. So that's what I spend the weekends doing.
Watching soccer.
Watching a lot of football.
Watching a lot of football, yeah. Well, it's...
We're now kind of off topic a little bit.
I have a question is, in terms of the absolute gap, how do you see it being part of the future? How does that really relate to the future? Because I think you believe in the absolute gap that exists, and that there's always going to be that tension is always going to be there.
Right.
Whether the language is difference or the ontological difference, it changes over time.
Yeah.
But I think there's still, and my language is a little bit different from your language. Everybody has kind of different languages, but there is. I think there's a certain parallel, going on with at least continental philosophy. How do you see that moving into the future?
I think that, the easy answer is to say the future is a disaster, things, you either believe, it seems to me that how you see human beings ultimately comes down to a question of something like belief. Do you believe that human beings are fundamentally wicked, self-interested, voracious creatures that are out for their own ends? In which case, politically, you're going to end up with some version of authoritarianism. Or do you believe that human beings are fundamentally decent creatures that find themselves in a really bad situation? I prefer to believe
the latter.
The latter. And that decency is something, and that openness that we have to each other, it happens, but it happens. Then the question becomes a question of scale. And for me, questions of politics and much else are questions of scale. And if we use the wrong scale, which at this point would be, how do we get America back or something like that maybe that's never going to happen. But there would be, there are groups, there are ways in which you can find other people who would experience the gap in the same way as you, and that could be your friends or people that you have contact with, and that could be 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 or more than that, and that's enough, I think. The scale, if you stay with that scale, I think extraordinary things happen all the time. I think human beings are the kind of beings that are fundamentally decent and are capable of doing extraordinary things in concert with each other. And when the scale gets back to front, as it is in, let's say, normal politics, then all the problems arise, it seems to me. So I think you have to look at the details.
Mhm.
And I think I think for me, as a non-native New Yorker, one of the things that always fascinates me about this place is that this is, you know, at one level, this is an awful, you know, commercial machine of a city, right?
Mhm.
That drives people into the gutter, or, you know, puts people at the top of skyscrapers, and where the police are whatever, and, you know, it's there are reasons to be suspicious in a city like New York, and yet you can find in everyday interaction thousands of things which contradict that in people's experience. There are moments of human warmth, of compassion, of benevolence, and it's those that you have to. And there's something about, for me, my experience of New York is very much that experience of kind of low-level, detailed benevolence in a kind of mechanism that is pushing the other way completely. And that's kind of the odyssey of this place, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the future is, I'm you know, there's no, I think it's easy. There's an easy kind of fatalism, apocalypticism that we see played out in movies, right?
Sure.
Yeah, it used to be that the end of the world was going to happen. Now the end of the world happens sometime in the past, and the movie takes place sometime after the end of the world. You know, that's too easy. It's too seductive, and it passes over the interesting grain and detail of actual human life, which is much richer than that.
All right.
Thank you, Skoto. Thank you,